fundamentally transformative, okay? And that's the movement that culture needs to undergo, not just somehow find a way to fit its existing paradigm around taking care of nature, right? But the demand to take care of nature forces a fundamental transformation of the existing paradigm, right? He contrasts his deep or radical ecological worldview with the dominant shallow or reform paradigm, the shallow worldview, which he finds to be typical of mainstream environmentalism, is merely an extension of European and North American anthropocentrism. Its reasons for conserving, well, right? Think E.O. Wilson here, right? Arnie Naas is just going to have some harsh things to say about the approach of a thinker like E.O. Wilson. Because E.O. Wilson, however radical as environmental proposal, and they are, he wants to set aside 40% of planet Earth, 40% of the terrestrial part of planet Earth for wildlife, for biodiversity preservation, right? That's very, very radical. Fundamental restructuring of our economic, political, and social and cultural systems, right? But at the level of thinking, at this deeper metaphysical level, he's just shockingly shallow and shockingly mainstream and shockingly establishment, right? Remember E.O. Wilson's arguments about how the only really ethical argument is the one that appeals to people's selfishness, right? Naas would just say, man, that's just the epitome of shallowness. And we need to go a lot deeper than that. We need to change our thinking, okay? The shallow, let's see. All right, the shallow world, the shallow ecologist cites use value, right? Human use value for whatever biodiversity preservation policies it recommends, right? The deep ecological worldview, in contrast, questions the fundamental assumptions of European and North American anthropocentrism. It digs conceptually deeper. In doing so, deep ecological thinking is not a slight reform of our present society, but a substantial reorientation of our whole civilization and a reorientation of our moral universe. Okay? Going back to, what does enlightenment entail for moral philosophy, right? We know what enlightenment entails for astronomy, for example, right? And for many physical sciences. We know what enlightenment entails, right? For astronomy, it entails a shift from a geocentric model of our solar system to a heliocentric model of our solar system. What does it mean? What does enlightenment mean for moral philosophy? What is the restructuring of our moral universe that maybe is analogous to the shift among astronomical, astronomy, among science of the solar system to a helios? What happened in moral philosophy? The deep ecologist would say that real enlightenment, right, getting away from self-imposed immaturity, right, which is enlightenment, with regard to our moral obligations to non-human entities, involves a shift of center. The center of gravity of our moral universe shifts from anthropos, from the human being, to a more objective account, right, of what the ecological whole requires to be healthy, right, and vibrant and beautiful, right? So in the end, right, deep ecology ends up taking us largely to the same philosophical place that Aldo Leopold takes us, right? If we accept the neo-Kantian moment in Aldo Leopold, right? The deep ecologists clearly seem to be more radical too, right? They would acknowledge the insight and agree with the insight that consequentialist anthropocentric thinking remains relativistic, right? It remains relativistic, and to adopt an objective view of our obligations to ecological wholes involves shifting the center of our moral universe away from anthropos, right? Away from our species to the ecosystem as a whole, all right? So, this radicalism has inspired environmental activists of many stripes to hoist up deep ecology as their banner in calling for nothing less than the redirection of human history. All right, very radical policy proposals. No compromise in defense of Mother Earth, which, if you were to right? Act that out. There'll probably be some foot stamping, right? Which is another good reason, another good indication that the deep ecologists belong up there with the neo-Kantians, remember? Because they're not just saying this is good for humans long term, right? They don't want to flirt with that kind of, that's too, right? That's too consequentialist, too anthropocentric. They want to say, these are our obligations and we will not compromise them, right? We will not begin down the serpent windings of utilitarianism, right? They're offering us an absolute ethic, which is the same, right? That's what the neo-Kantians are offering us. An absolute ethic, an absolute guideline to our moral obligations to ecological wholes. Okay? I actually have some personal, briefly, with, I was living in Eugene during, and going to graduate school and writing my doctoral thesis during the 1990s, and had some friends. Eugene's not a very big town, right? And people who like to go river rafting and who like to go hiking on the weekends and stuff tend to bump into each other and kind of loosely know each other, right? So anyway, I ended up hanging out with some people who were part of this Environmental Liberation Front, Animal Liberation Front. That I thought I had a slide on here, maybe not. Anyway, and I was, that was my first encounter with deep ecology, was, hanging out with people who thought that it meant, and who didn't really understand, and my effort, right, I was trying to understand radical environmentalism philosophically. I wasn't interested, in making some kind of political statement or even really being a radical environmentalist myself, at least in that. Anyway, but these people were involved in some of the people that I knew, and I hardly knew any of them really, but one or two of them I ended up going river rafting with, and then a couple of years later, after they had all been rounded up by the FBI and various police forces, and most of them convicted, and they pleaded guilty and got fairly long, between 5 and 13 years. But they did things, like the reason why I'm getting into this now, right, is because when asked philosophically to explain why they had such extreme views about industrial civilization and the systematic harms that technology and industrial society are inflicting on the natural world, when asked to explain, many of them would cite deep ecology, right? And so that was my first exposure to deep ecology, and that was really there was one guy there in Eugene that had a drug problem, and also happened to be probably some kind of somebody who got a thrill out of burning things. What is that? A pyromaniac. Right? He was some kind of a pyromaniac, and he also had a drug problem. And he was the only one of the group that really had problems like that, or that had any kind of psychological attachment. Arson was their preferred mode of political protest / subversion. They caused hundreds of millions of dollars of property damage, and they burned down a lot of very expensive properties, and they would leave messages after they committed their crimes explaining that they were doing this in the name of Mother Earth, or in the name of these radical environmental principles. But they were all rounded up one day. But this one guy that had the problem, right? That was a firebug. Had some, he clearly was messed up, and he was addicted to drugs. He ended up having some interaction with the police in Eugene, and some astute police officer connected the truck that he was using with one of these crimes, with one of these arsons. And so they ended up grilling him, right, detaining him, and he ended up admitting that he was involved in all this stuff. And then they put a wire on him, right? They put a microphone on him and had him travel all over the country. Because by now, this was like 2 or 3 years after, or 4 or 5 years after, I'm not sure how long, anyway, some years had passed. And the group that had committed all these acts of arson and eco-sabotage had all gone their own ways, right? Some of them were on the East Coast, some of them were in Eastern Oregon, and anyway, but they put this guy, Jake Ferguson, on an airplane and they flew him around and he acted like he was just visiting his old friends, right? But he was getting their statements on tape, right? He got them to say things that he recorded that were incriminating. And then one day the FBI arrested all of them, all over the country, several different places. And then next thing you know, they're in Eugene in federal court facing, and they all plead guilty, and they all have to, then they're involved in sentencing here, right? They have to get their sentences assigned by the judge, and they didn't put up a fight. They knew that they were going to be found guilty, and so they didn't put up, right? They just pleaded guilty. They said, we did this, right? Almost all of them. There was one, I think, up in Seattle that refused to plead guilty. But anyway, by then I had gone to law school. Isn't this interesting how this all, and I kind of, lost track of many of these people too, but when I got out of law school, I wanted to be a criminal defense attorney. So I wanted to get some experience, and I ended up having contact with this attorney who represented one of those guys. And so I ended up working with her, and then I ended up having more kind of deeper interactions with one of these defendants who ended up getting one of the longest terms, and corresponded with them too while he was in prison. And that was kind of my connection with deep ecology. But interestingly enough, the no compromise in defense of Mother Earth, right? This neo-Kantian philosophy that they seem to have based their work on, was itself not fully consistent, right? And I just like to point out here, for those of you who might, just to think about this. How can a critical thinker justify an act of property destruction? How is that justifiable? What were these radical environmentalists saying to each other, or when asked, how do you justify? Okay, there are some things that they did which were, I don't know, different categories of crimes. They burned down the ranger station in Oak Ridge, which was a very calamitous event for scientists who were researching. They had a lot of research projects, and they had accumulated all this data that was stored there, and it was all burned up. So that was, anyway, and then they did other things, like they burned down a meat rendering plant, right? Because they were offended by this. They set free these wild horses in Eastern Oregon. They burned down Vail ski resort development, right? That was threatening wolverine habitat. Anyway, if you were to choose a normative orientation to explain that this was the right thing to do, these various acts I just described are morally right, what would you choose? Would you choose utilitarianism, or would you choose Kantianism, deontology? What do you do to a property owner when you burn his stuff down? What are you doing to that property owner when you choose to make a political statement by burning his stuff down?
You're instrumentalizing.
It seems as though a Kantian would have a problem with that form of political action. All right? Now, the people who were doing these radical things, who were burning stuff down, they identified themselves as combatants in a war. That's how they thought of themselves, right? They thought of themselves as combatants who were involved in a war where they were defending Mother Earth, and the logging companies and the energy companies and the mining companies, right? The drillers and the frackers were at war with their people, right? We weren't just people, but the trees, the forest, the wildlife, the wolverines, the wolves, etc., right? And so they, in their mind, were able to justify. Now, they never caused harm to a human being. As far as we know, they didn't cause harm to a sentient animal of any kind, all right? And they scouted out their acts. All of their eco-sabotage was carefully planned and carefully executed to minimize, as far as possible, risk to sentient life. Okay, so maybe, who knows, maybe a mouse got killed or something like that. But by and large, they were hugely successful in not hurting anybody. Okay? Yes?
Wouldn't they be charged with war crimes? If they're declaring, like, they think that they're...
Well, I'm just trying to get at philosophically how they, in their no-compromise philosophy, which is this neo-Kantian philosophy, how they can justify instrumentalizing a property owner, right?
Well, war is war. I mean, if you...
In war, you throw all of your principles out the window, exactly. And that, if you want to think about their lives under the lens of this, it's kind of tragic what happened to them. They messed up really bad. Their thinking was erroneous at some point, is what I'm suggesting, right?
Well, it seems like they were following them drug baddies. That's pretty stupid.
No, they didn't follow him. No, he was the weak link in the chain, is all he was. They weren't following him.
Well, but you said
they allowed him to hang out with them and stuff like that, and then he blabbermouthed to the cops because he was kind of unhinged, you know.
Well, but you said he was an arsonist, like he was.
And he seemed to enjoy it. That's right.
So
he's the guy that torched that ranger station.
Well, see, it sounds like he might have been the leader because he was the one instrumenting all this.
He wasn't actually the leader.
Pyro.
No, he wasn't the leader. No.
They were charged with terrorism, actually.
Well, so then how did they all just decide to do arson then? Like, did they all have arson problems, or
No.
This doesn't make sense to me.
They believed that they were making political statements against, you know, and actually, you know, I mean, they had tried other avenues. They came from activist backgrounds. They had done door-to-door canvassing. They had worked for grassroots environmental organizations. They had done a lot of legitimate things to advance their goals. And at some point, they came to the conclusion that legitimate activities were insufficient and that the situation called for radical action. And you know, so they took these actions strategically. They were not psychologically invested in burning things down. They just felt like a large statement was necessary in order to bring people's attention, right, to environmental catastrophe.
Did it work?
No, it backfired. It backfired really bad, and that's why, you know, I don't want to psychoanalyze anybody. I prefer, if possible, to identify an error in their thinking that led them to commit these actions that instrumentalized people and were morally wrong, and yet were justified because they believed that that there was nothing else they could do.
Well, Malcolm X said by any means necessary.
Yeah.
And that was between humans. So,
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, so yeah.
you gotta do what you gotta do when you gotta do it.
But you notice how a neo-Kantian would have a serious concern with political violence of any kind, right? That's what you are doing that's what their eco-sabotage is best described as. It's a form of political violence, right? And for a Kantian, political violence of any kind is morally impermissible because it involves instrumentalizing a human being to make a political point.
How many times can you roll over before it's enough? Before you say, I'm tired of rolling over.
I'm just pointing out, you know, that I don't know. That's a different question, right? That's more like a psychological question. Really, it's how much can you put up with? I don't know. Everyone can put up with something differently. But rationally, reasonably, justifying property damage for any reason sounds like you're going to go against Kant's dictum of don't instrumentalize a human being. Now, I guess you could say those human beings are involved, or they did stuff like they targeted this timber, this lumber mill in Roseburg that accommodated old growth trees. I think it was the last one in Oregon, actually, that still, accommodated they still milled old growth ancient trees, right? So they burned it down, right? And anyway, I don't have any answers. I really don't. Philosophically, you all have to wrestle with these tensions. But in this class, all I would ask you to do is recognize them. Recognize that you're crossing over a line when you decide to commit political violence, no matter what your goal is. No matter what your goal is, you're crossing over a line when you decide to commit political violence like this. No matter how hard you try, and succeed in not hurting anybody. Which these guys did. They succeeded in not hurting anybody. Now, some of them did get sentence enhancements for terror, because I think there was one act that was significantly risky, because I guess there was this big propane tank that could have caught on fire. And anyway, and there was some indication that thing didn't catch on fire just out of sheer luck. So they ended up getting some extra years tacked onto their sentence because some of their acts were, anyway. I don't know, how helpful it is talking about, but I guess it's helpful to just keep in mind that, that Earth First has inspired people to do some not Earth First, right, but this way of thinking about the biotic rights of living organisms and communities, and this no compromise has inspired some. And so we're not just talking about, some inconsequential ivory tower worldview here. We're talking about a view that has been used. Anyway, let's take a 5-minute break, all right, and then we'll come back and do our deep ecology analysis. And all right. Okay, good, thank you. Yeah, no worries.
As far as the final project goes, were you going to have a sign-up sheet that you circulate in your class?
That's how I'll do it. I think we'll identify the defenders of the hydropower system first.
Yeah.
It's not where I personally stand, but I want to defend that side.
Yeah. All right. Well, that'll be easy then.
Yeah. And I want to eat these with like that peanut skin on it. It's like, nah.
I know, but it's raining quite a bit.
I don't know. Finish class.
Oh man, he's looking like all the bit of attention to the thought.
Yeah,
They're not free to get to anything.
yeah. Everything's better after.
Yeah, I don't know.
Huh? Smells like, there's like weird, little lines in
Last time I wasn't even toasted.
No.
What the hell? What's the point of a bagel that's not toasted? That's
But
fucking
he's going
bread.
to be
Bread.
after him.
Am I wrong?
Yeah, my brother.
All right. So, an axiology of biocentric egalitarianism, and then they want to say an ontology of metaphysical holism. Some students get thrown off by this word ontology, and they think, well, you know, a professor's been using this word metaphysics or metaethics all term, and all of a sudden he's expecting us to, use this other word. Ontology is the study of being. Okay, ontos is a Greek word for being. So the study of being, that's real, real wow. But it kind of took over the role of what in the old days they used to call metaphysics. After Kant, metaphysics is called into question, and there's some doubt as to whether we can even do metaphysics anymore. And so, at that point, among the phenomenologists are big on ontology. If you read Heidegger or Merleau-Ponty, then you'll encounter this word quite a bit. The study of existence, right? The existentialists want to talk about ontology too. The study of existence or the study of being. Anyway, all right, so two fundamentals. And these may be, as I've already suggested, they may not be compatible philosophically. And so for the resource manager who's looking for a comprehensive and workable, right, integrated and workable, practicable management philosophy, perhaps deep ecology has something, leaves something to be desired because it's offering us two perhaps incompatible, okay, guidelines. One guideline, biocentric egalitarianism, which practically speaking would lead the land manager to maximize the life, comfort, well-being of every individual living member of the land, air, water, wildlife, right, that the land manager is concerned about, right? And yet that concern to care for every is inconsistent, right, with metaphysical holism, right? Remember Leopold, right? He's not opposed. In fact, sometimes we have to take out our guns and go blast away at some elk or some deer, some ungulate individual animals because the herd is too big and it's damaging the ecosystem. So sometimes we have to throw our biocentric egalitarianism, if we ever flirted with that at all, we've got to just throw it out the window and bite the bullet and, go kill individuals for the sake of the health of the whole, right? So these two guidelines might not be both. You can't follow them both at the same time, right? So there may be, deep ecology is, not as clear as one would like from a land management perspective, but at the same time, from a cultural movement perspective, well, maybe that's a good thing, because, I read someone describe deep ecology more as a literary movement than a land management philosophy. And I think that's an insight that you're onto something when you start thinking that way. And perhaps not just literary, right, but a literary cultural movement. If you think of deep ecology as a literary cultural movement and not necessarily an effort to articulate principles on how to manage our land, air, water, wildlife, then you're going to probably have a more sympathetic view. And many self-described deep ecologists are coming sort of from a literary point of view and not really from a policy point of view, right? Thinkers like Edward Abbey, right? The guy that advocated monkey wrenching in the 70s, right? He said he'd rather, if he had to shoot a gun at anybody, he'd rather shoot a gun at a human being than at a rattlesnake, because he felt more, in common with the snake than he did with very misanthropic kind of a guy. But he was a novelist, right? He wasn't a political activist. He was also a political activist, but he was primarily a novelist, a literary figure. And the same can be said of many of the heroes of the deep ecology movement, right? Robinson Jeffers is a poet. In any event. So biocentric, just to review, biocentric egalitarianism holds that all biota have equal intrinsic value, right? Remember, Schweitzer was the guy that articulated that for us, and then, we've encountered it from a few other writers too. The idea that, if the entity is alive, it has a basic moral status. And that basic moral status is the same in every living organism, right? That basic moral status is the same. The equal right to live and blossom is an intuitively clear and obvious value axiom. All right? All organisms and entities in the ecosphere as parts of the interrelated whole are equal in intrinsic worth. Okay? If you're down with, this intrinsic value, this questionable metaphysical language, then this kind of sounds like Leopold, doesn't it? This sounds like Leopold's argument. Right? That's why all members of the biotic community have intrinsic value, because they are all, as best as we know, right, they are all integral to the health of the whole. Right? So we have to treat them all as having value. All right, and Nas shrewdly preempts invariable attacks on this idea of the equal worth. Right? You can think of Rush Limbaugh, oh, that's crazy, right? That's crazy, all right? There's no way you can treat all individuals equally. Nas understands that. He's not an idiot. Same thing with Schweitzer understands that. Regan understands that. All the thinkers all the deontological thinkers who we've read, the neo-Kantian thinkers, they all understand that the absolute ethic that they're offering us is going, once we bring it out into the real world and practical decisions, we're not going to be able to implement, right? We need mediation principles to mediate under situations where vital human needs conflict with vital more than human needs, right? So in principle though, right? And that's all Schweitzer wanted to demonstrate to us too. That's all Rolston wants to demonstrate to us, right? Rolston just wants to demonstrate to us that all species have intrinsic value. Now when it comes to difficult questions, like the snail darter in Tennessee, right? Hundreds of millions of dollars have already been contributed to this project. Are we really going to stop the project just for this one species, right? So, Rolston too recognizes that, but he's not interested in getting into the minutia about how to resolve those kinds of conflicts. He's just interested in demonstrating to us that on the face of it, in principle, right? In principle, we have obligations to all living beings. All right? All right, but they do, right? Any real